Good evening, Dr. Abhiruchi and Dr. Shyam. I am Dr. Ramakrishna Reddy.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening, sir. Good evening.
Are you comfortable?
Yes, yes, fine.
Good evening.
The web team helped you?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yes.
We will start around 6 to 2 minutes past 6. We will wait a couple of minutes after 6
Okay.
for the participants. 2 minutes past 6. We will wait.
Good evening, Ramakrishna sir, Dr. Arun here.
Arun. Yeah.
Good evening, Shyam and Dr. Abhiruchi. Ma'am, sir, actually Shyam has some animations, so he will be doing the screen sharings. After that, once Shyam's session is over, Madam will share her PPT here and she will do the session.
Yeah, exactly. Dr. Shyam is first speaker.
Yeah.
And then the second one, Dr. Abhiruchi.
Yeah, he will be doing the screen sharing. Later, Madam will directly upload. Madam, you have after the Dr. Shyam session, you have to upload the PPT after Dr. Shyam session.
Okay. So in the meantime, we can allow questions for Dr. Shyam also.
Exactly. The sound clarity is everything fine, no sir?
Yeah. From my side, it's okay.
Yeah.
Right. So when one speaker is, speaking, rest of you can just mute your mics.
Yes. That is a good idea.
None of you, all of you don't press any button on the top which says pause or end or log out, because the session will end abruptly.
Sure. We will wait another couple of minutes.
Sure, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you.
చెప్పండి సార్.
Hello, sir. Is there anybody from administration?
Admin side, Divya is there. You want any help?
No, I just wanted to know how you communicate these things, because I never received anything like previous class. Only there is a inter-department communication, but there is no communication from ISA or probably your website. How you are usually communicating with other people?
Only through the public chat. There is a public chat option on the left side.
No, not now. About this program.
About
after you have one more program.
I didn't get you.
About this class or about this seminar. ISA is supposed to communicate to the other anesthesiologists, isn't it?
Yes. We have communicated with all the PGs, all medical colleges.
Okay, to only convey to the only medical colleges.
Yes.
Not for
no, Dr. Shyam,
yes,
there was a link that was provided to everyone. They have registered online already. 120 people had actually registered. Then in addition to that, we will be sharing the link and also the live YouTube. This will be going on YouTube also now, live.
Okay.
So anyone who wants to view this can also view it on YouTube directly.
Already 17 people are watching on YouTube, and we will wait another 2 minutes for the participants.
Yeah.
Exactly 6:04 we will start.
Okay, sir. No issues.
So, welcome to the ISA Telangana PG teaching program. This is second class. We started 2 weeks ago with Dr. Gopinath sir's class. So, today we are going to present two topics. First one is basics of coronary blood flow and implications for anesthesiologist. The speaker is from Nizam's Institute of Medical Sciences, Dr. Shyam Sundar. He is associate professor in anesthesia there. Then the second topic will be dealt by Dr. Abhiruchi. She is a additional professor at Nizam's Institute of Medical Sciences. She will be dealing with the coronary artery disease and perioperative management. So first topic, Dr. Shyam Sundar's basics of coronary blood flow and implications for anesthesiologist. I request Dr. Shyam Sundar to start his presentation. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, sir, for your kind presentation. Today I'm going to tell about few basics about coronary blood flow and implications for the anesthesiologist. Next few minutes, I will going to tell the various factors that determine the coronary blood flow and myocardial oxygen demand and supply. And finally, what are the various strategies that we need to understand as anesthesiologists for appropriate management of myocardial oxygen supply and demand. And when compared with systemic vascular bed, the coronary vascular circulation have some distinctive features. Those are the resting basal blood flow to the each gram of myocardium per minute is 1 ml, which is relatively higher than when compared with muscle and other organs. And the second thing is, unlike other organs, 2/3 of the coronary blood flow occurs during the phase of diastole, which is in contrary to the rest of the organs, because most of the organs receive majority of the blood flow during the systole time. And the extraction ratio of oxygen at the resting state is 75%, again, which is 3 times higher than the normal total body extraction ratio, which is around 25%. And finally, coronaries have capability to dilate so that it can accommodate 4 to 5 times of the blood flow when compared with the normal resting lungs. Now, how these features have beneficial effects for the coronary circulation when especially the demand increases, and how these things which help the myocardium to regulate its own blood supply without increasing the cardiac output and coronary perfusion pressure, we will see in few slides. Going back to the basics of anatomy, heart is supplied by the left and right coronary arteries, and left coronary artery is the major artery which supplies 70 to 80% of the blood flow to the heart. And going deep into the transmural arrangements of the capillaries, if you see, there is epicardial arteries which runs in the interventricular or interatrial grooves, and there is a subendocardial arterial plexus. There is a communicating arteries which travel from the outside, that is epicardium, to the subendocardium plexus. From there, various arteries will arise and supply the myocardium. And now we'll see what are the various factors that will determine the coronary blood flow. So there are 5 important factors that determine the blood flow. Those are coronary perfusion pressure, coronary vascular smooth muscle tone, and coronary perfusion time, cardiac output, and blood viscosity. Generally, whenever there is no change in the acute intravascular volume status, the viscosity may not alter. So the effect of viscosity on blood flow regulation to the myocardium is relatively less. However, patient with extremes of hemoglobin like hematocrit more than 60%, then there is a perfusion problems and they can cause myocardial ischemia. And coming to the first factor, coronary perfusion pressure, which is a driving force of the blood to pump from the arterial to the venous side of the myocardium. Here, the driving force is diastolic blood pressure of the aorta, and which has to work against the capillary resistance and the venous pressure, that is left ventricular end diastolic pressure or coronary venous pressure. So whenever there is increase in diastolic pressure, there will be a better perfusion, or when there is a decrease in diastolic pressure, as you see in patients with the sepsis with the low systemic vascular resistance or patients with aortic regurgitation, there is a fall in coronary perfusion pressure, which results in fall in coronary blood flow. In contrary, whenever there is increase in coronary venous pressure or left ventricular diastolic pressure, like situations like increased intravascular volume or valvular regurgitations or heart failure, there is a decreased coronary perfusion pressure and low blood flow to the myocardium. So in contrast to the left ventricle, which receives the blood flow during the diastole, RV receives both systole and diastole. As you see in this picture and table, if you see the blood pressure in the left ventricle during systole is almost all equal to the aorta. That's the reason there is no perfusion pressure and there is no blood flow. Whereas in right ventricle, the pressures in the systole is 20, which is much lesser than the aorta. So there is a blood flow. So as you see in this graph, the systolic blood flow in the right coronary artery is much more better than the diastole. Whereas in the left coronary artery, the diastolic blood flow, because the diastole, during diastole, the gradient between the aorta and LV is high. For that reason, there is a more blood flow during the diastole when compared with the systole. Normal coronary pressure is around 70 to 80 millimeters of mercury in normal human beings. And next most important time is diastolic duration. So as we seen that normally cardiac cycle when the heart rate is 0.8 seconds, the systolic duration is 0.3 and diastolic duration is 0.5. That means 30% of the duration is systole and 60%, 70% is the diastole. However, when you increase the heart rate, as you see in this graph, only diastolic time will shorten, whereas systolic time, that is 0.3 seconds, remain constant. Suppose if you increase the heart rate from 70 to 140, the systolic time will be double, that becomes 60% of the 1 minute, whereas diastole will become 30%, that's 1/3 of the 1 minute. That only 20 seconds will be the diastole duration and 40 seconds will be the systolic duration when the heart rate is double. So as the diastolic time is reduced during the tachycardia, there is a decreased time available for the coronary perfusion. And now we look into the what happens in the transpleural blood flow. We all know that subendocardium is the part of subcardium more at risk for development of ischemia whenever there is a perfusion and demand mismatch. So what are the reasons? Or as you see in this left side of the picture, during systole, the subendocardium is exposed as it is close to the LV cavity. It exposed to the LV cavity pressures. That means the intramyocardial pressures are 120 near to the LV cavity, that is subendocardial layer. Whereas when it goes away from the LV cavity to the outside of the myocardium, that is the subepicardial layer, it is only just 20, which may be above the capillary pressure. So it allows perfusion even during systole to the subepicardial layer of the myocardium. Whereas in mid and subendocardial myocardial layers may not get any blood supply because of high intramyocardial pressures. So during diastole, the LV cavity pressures falls to 5 to 10 millimeters of mercury, and there will be a blood flow across the capillary blood. Again, if you see here, there is relatively high intramural blood flow in the subendocardial layer when compared with the subepicardial layers of the myocardium. Because of these reasons, we expect that there is relatively more blood flow in the epicardium when compared with the subendocardium. However, under basal conditions, there is no ischemia, and the ratio between the subendocardial to subepicardial ratio is approximately 1.2, that more or less equal. The main reasons for this are there is more number of beta receptors in the subendocardial artery structures, which causes better dilatation of the arteries, and also whenever there is ischemia, there is more production of adenosine, which cause capillary dilatation of the subendocardium, and also there is, as you see in the previous picture, there is redundancy of capillary anastomosis and the subendocardium, which will help in better blood supply during resting conditions. However, when there is a stress, that means whenever there is increased heart rate or hypertrophy or decreased blood supply because of coronary artery stenosis, there is a possibility of development of ischemia because in the subendocardial layer. But however, in basal conditions, we don't see any ischemia because of compensatory mechanisms, as I explained this. Next, coming to the factors that determine the coronary blood flow. Coronary smooth muscle tone is the primary regulator of vascular coronary blood flow, because under normal conditions, the diameter of the vessel will determine the blood flow. As you see in this picture, Poiseuille law dictates that the amount of blood flow is related to the radius to the fourth power. That means any change, small change in the diameter of the vessel will badly influence the blood flow. And by understanding this, we know that when the coronary perfusion pressure is increases, and coronary blood flow also increases. The coronary blood flow is depicted in the y-axis, and coronary perfusion pressure is depicted in the x-axis. However, the relationship, as you see in this picture, it's a linear, but it's not in real life. It may not be looking linear. The relationship here is there is after 60 millimeters of mercury, there is a plateau in the blood flow. That means further increase in the cerebral blood coronary perfusion pressure. There is no change in the coronary blood flow until 150. Beyond that, again it is increased. So this is exactly how it looks. Because as I created graphics, it may not be like just like a real picture, but this graphics will understand you what happens when the blood pressure is increased from 60 to 150, that is auto-regulatory range. So whenever there is increase in the pressure beyond 60, there is a progressive vasoconstriction in the coronary arteries. That's the reason, in spite of increase in the pressure, there is no change in the blood flow. However, once maximum vasoconstriction is achieved, further increase in the cerebral blood flow causes increase in the blood flow. At the same time, whenever the blood pressure or coronary perfusion pressure falls from 150 to 60, then again slowly vasodilatation appears, and it will be progressive. So once it reaches the 60, more or less there is a maximum vasodilatation. Beyond this point, further reduction of the perfusion pressure, which leads to fall in the coronary blood flow. This is called auto-regulatory range. So what are the implications of this is, as you see in this picture, the ratio between the resting coronary blood flow and to the maximum possible coronary blood flow after exercise, the difference is called coronary flow result. That means that this much, as you see in this picture, 1 ml per minute is the basal coronary blood flow, which can be increased 5 times, that is 5 ml per minute. So there is a good coronary reserve, which helps the heart when there is increased demand. It can easily extract the more blood without much change in the cardiac or coronary perfusion pressure. So, what are the implications of this auto-regulation? It's a easy way to increase the blood supply of the heart, because as you know that the extraction ratio of oxygen for the heart is 75% at basal condition. That means 75% of oxygen delivered through the arteries will be absorbed by the myocardium. So if there is any increase in heart rate or increase in force of contraction, the extra demand can be easily met by simply coronary vasodilatation. So otherwise, if this facility, this auto-regulation on this coronary reserve is not there, the heart has to increase the cardiac output or coronary perfusion pressure to meet its needs. So coronary vascular resistance is primarily dependent on the metabolic factors. Those are oxygen level at the myocardium, that's hypoxia will cause vasodilatation, and adenosine, ATP, and pH level, that is acidosis, potassium, reactive oxygen species, and hypercarbia. They all basically act as a coronary vasodilators and causes vascular dilatation. As you see in this picture, whenever there is increased demand during resting conditions, the autoregulation curve moves upwards. Because as the metabolic demands are increased, the blood flow also improves to better supply oxygen, so that there will be a balance between the supply and demand of the oxygen. In contrary, whenever there is decrease in myocardial demand, there also coronary blood flow will be reduced. So the other important things that determine the smooth muscle tone of the coronaries are endothelial dependent control. Endothelium produces both vasoconstrictors as well as vasodilators. The main vasodilators are endothelium derived relaxing factor and hyperpolarization factor and prostaglandin I2s, and the vasoconstrictor thromboxane and the PGF2 alpha. So patients with coronary artery disease or atherosclerosis, the balance will be tilted toward the vasoconstrictor side. Otherwise, normally, depending on in normal patients, normal persons, the balance will be depending on the need. Coming to the neural control. So as I described earlier, the epicardial arteries are predominantly supplied by the alpha receptors, which causes vasoconstriction when there is sympathetic stimulation. At the same time, the subendocardial plexus are supplied by the beta receptors, which causes vasodilatation. So parasympathetic nerves, even though they are relatively less distributed to the coronaries through the vagus nerve, and the direct action of this parasympathetic stimulation, mild vasodilatation. However, the indirect effects of the nervous systems are more important than the direct action. That means whenever there is sympathetic stimulation, there is increased norepinephrine level and increased force of contraction and heart rate, which ultimately leads to more metabolism and more blood supply to the heart. In contrary, whenever there is a vagus stimulation, there is decreased metabolism, decreased heart rate and force of contraction, and reduction of coronary blood flow. Humoral control like vasopressin and angiotensin are basically coronary vasoconstrictors. However, in normal physiological condition, the levels that required to cause coronary vasoconstriction by vasopressin is relatively low. Most of the time, the plasma levels available in physiological conditions will only cause antidiuretic effect. It won't cause coronary vasoconstriction. Whereas atrial natriuretic peptide and histamine may cause vasodilatation. The ANP and BNP, especially more produced during the heart failure, probably have some role in coronary vasodilatation also. So coming to the coronary blood flow reserve. What happens in patients with coronary heart disease? As I told previously, this is the maximum possible vasodilatation. When the coronary artery disease is there, the maximum amount of blood supply will be compromised. Because of that reason, the coronary reserve also will be less in these patients. So for a hypothetical situation, Here, the maximum possible blood flow in coronary artery disease patient is around 3.5 ml per minute. And when the patient, apart from coronary disease, on the top, if they have tachycardia, this reserve is further reduced by the reduced diastolic show, and there is a further compromise in the coronary reserve. So not only just the disease condition, and also hemodynamics like heart rate and the force of contraction also determine the coronary blood flow reserve. So there is mild difference between the coronary blood flow and myocardial oxygen supply. So myocardial oxygen not only focused on the blood flow, it also depends on the oxygen content of the blood. As you see in this equation, hemoglobin percentage, hemoglobin concentration and saturation is an important determinants of the oxygen delivery apart from the coronary blood flow. So usually hemoglobin more than 8 to 10 mg/% is sufficient to cause adequate blood supply to the myocardium. So coming to the factors that determine the balance between the myocardial oxygen supply and demand. So far we have discussed the various factors that determine the supply. Now move on to the factors that determine the oxygen demand. So there are three main factors that determine the oxygen demand: heart rate, wall tension, and contractility. As you see in the right side of this picture, this is nothing but a pressure volume loop, and this picture explaining how the work is distributed. The most of the work is basically used for ejecting the stroke volume against the resistance offered by the aortic pressure. So the more is the afterload, the more is the external work, and the more is the oxygen consumption. So the more the contractility, the more rate of contraction, there is a more oxygen demand. And the second thing is wall tension. Again, wall tension, for better understanding, we need to look at the Laplace law, which states that the stress on the myocardium is more proportional to the left ventricular systolic pressures and also the radius of the left ventricular cavity during systole or early part of the systole. So the more the pressure inside the ventricle, that means whenever there is increased afterload in patients with hypertension or aortic stenosis, or patient with increased left ventricular and diastolic volumes like fluid overload, heart failure, or regurgitant valvular heart disease, they all increase the wall stress and cause more oxygen demand. And the final and most important thing is the heart rate. So once the heart rate is increased, it also increase number of contractions per minute and also increase the force of contraction as explained by the trapeze phenomena. And as we have seen that heart rate also affect the supply. So heart rate is single most important factor that will decide the balance between oxygen demand and supply. As you see in this picture, so whenever there is demand increase, the baseline of the autoregulation moves up and there is a further compromise in the coronary vascular reserve. So coming to the effects of anesthesia on coronary blood flow. So both intravenous and inhalation agent, more or less, they have negative inotropism and a little bit coronary vasodilatation. Because of these things, these agents are generally favorable for tilting the balance towards more of supply side. However, when you use high doses or if the agents which are having negative inotropic effect may cause precipitous fall in cardiac output and may cause hypotension, which can lead to reduction of blood flow. The another problem with isoflurane is steal phenomena. As you know that whenever there is a stenosis, the capillaries beyond the stenosis usually dilate so that the blood from the normal area will be diverted to the ischemic zone and the perfusion in the ischemic zone is better maintained. When you give isoflurane more than 1 night, then it causes generalized coronary vasodilatation and the normal vascular bed in the myocardium also dilates and there is more perfusion to the normal vascular bed and relatively less blood flow to the ischemic zone. That's why high flow of isoflurane or tachycardia and hypotension can provoke ischemia in susceptible patients. Now we see what happens in general anesthesia. So whenever there is normally general anesthesia is better profile. However, if you don't control the noxious stimuli that occurs during intubation, extubation, or surgical incision and awareness, there will be increased sympathetic stimulation and there is more demand and more oxygen demand will be increased. So adequate suppression of this stress response is very important whenever we give anesthesia to the compromised patients. Whereas in neuroaxial blockade, even though it won't have any direct effects on the coronary blood flow, however, by reducing the venous return and decreasing the systemic vascular resistance, it can sometimes cause precipitous fall in blood pressure, which can reduce the coronary blood flow. This is most prominent in patients with hypovolemia and low cardiac output patients. Opioids are the best agents to control the stress response. However, the opioids with intrinsic sympathomimetic activity like pentazocine and neuromuscular blockers with sympathomimetic activity of pancuronium should not be used in cardiac coronary artery stenosis patients, as they may cause tachycardia. And atracurium and dropcuronium, which can cause histamine release, can increase the heart rate and can reduce the coronary blood flow. And local anesthetic, usually they don't have direct effect on coronary vasculature. However, in high doses and toxic doses, they can cause negative inotropic action. So whenever you give anesthesia to these patients, we need to first assess the cardiac reserve. As we have been described about how the cardiac reserve is very important. So by taking proper history of effort tolerance, we give better idea about the cardiac reserve of the patient. The patient who are able to do exercise more than 12 to 15 minutes, they are relatively have better flow reserve than the people who are having less physical activity. So whenever there is less physical activity, less effort tolerance, we need to further evaluate by doing myocardial stress testing, either dopamine stress test or treadmill test or coronary angiogram to assess the maximum vasodilation possible, and also know the basic heart rate, blood pressure, which will explain the basal metabolic demand of the patient. Echocardiography also tells the LV myocardial hypertrophy, which gives idea about the basal metabolic needs of the myocardium. So once we know the flow reserve, patient whoever is having less coronary flow reserve, they are relatively high risk for the development of ischemia during surgery. So in those patients, we can, by doing appropriate monitoring, depending on the severity, we can select intraarterial placement or PA catheter or cardiac output monitor and echocardiography or cardiac output monitor. They all, like low risk patient, even CVP intraarterial line may be sufficient. Whereas moderate to high risk patient, echocardiography monitoring and cardiac output monitoring helps us in early detection of the mismatch between the demand and the supply, and also appropriate intervention, and the response to the intervention also can be assessed by these invasive monitoring techniques. So optimizing the oxygen demand by controlling the heart rate and avoiding increase in the afterload and avoiding increasing the preload can help in reducing the demand. At the same time, maintaining adequate aortic diastolic pressures and reducing the heart rate and maintaining hemoglobin and saturation will help in better supply of the blood to the myocardium. And whenever needed, coronary antispasmodic like NTG and nicotinic can be helpful for prevention of reversible component of the coronary vasoconstriction, which we see in coronary artery disease patients. So thanks for your patient listening. This is the slide showing all the factors so far we have discussed, how they influence the balance between the myocardial oxygen and supply. Thank you.